In those days, the shadows of despair often fell upon the most unlikely of souls, and among them was a man caught in the clutches of a fate cruelly spun by the endless turmoil of the times. He was surrounded by men of the lowest sort, some branded as malefactors, those whose faces were hardened by hardship and whose hands bore the marks of misdeeds. I, together with his friends, ran tirelessly through the labyrinthine streets, seeking some glimmer of hope, someone who might rescue him from the abyss. Among those we turned to was one named Bonaparte, a figure not easily reached, shrouded by the chaos that engulfed the city. The night stretched long and silent as I waited, accompanied by a friend of my husband's, for the commandant of Paris to return, but he did not come home. Midnight passed, and the darkness seemed to grow heavier with each hour. At dawn's early light, I returned once more, finding my husband alive but broken, his life hanging precariously by a thread. I recounted the harrowing events to him, though he seemed to bear little feeling for his friend's plight. Yet, with a flicker of resolve, he determined to write to Merlin, the Minister of Justice. I carried the letter, seeking the man who wore his grandeur like a mask, a Henry IV hat adorned with plumes, a stark contrast to the man beneath. He read the letter, but whether through indifference or cold calculation, he dismissed the matter as no longer his concern, passing it to the public administrators of the law. Thus began a harrowing journey through the cold corridors of power, where I found only harsh faces and cruel words. They told me the prisoner deserved death, and that the next day he would face the judge of the peace for his section, who alone would decide the fate that awaited him. The following morning, the prisoner was brought before the judge, a man named Le Maire, whose mild countenance belied the heavy burdens he bore. His manner was cold, but not cruel, a rare flicker of humanity amid the relentless machinery of justice. His examination was long, his brow furrowed with doubt and sorrow. When the moment of decision came, all seemed poised to condemn the prisoner. At 7 in the evening, I was summoned to the judge's chamber, and what greeted me was a scene etched with sorrow, a man weakened by a hemorrhage that had interrupted the examination, his breath labored and frail. The judge sat, head resting on hand, weighed down by the conflict between duty and compassion. I fell to my knees, pleading for mercy, and was joined by the judge's wife and daughters, whose gentle voices softened the air. This man, a good husband and father, wrestled with the laws that bound him, searching for a way to spare a life. Finally, he spoke. The morrow was decadi, a day when no proceedings could take place. If I could find 2 responsible persons to answer for the prisoner's appearance, he would allow him to return home, guarded by 2 keepers. By the next day, 2 friends were found to stand as bail, one a councillor of the court, the other a knight of St. Louis. And so, the prisoner was granted a fragile reprieve, kept under watchful eyes for 6 long months, until a cruel law forced those marked on the fatal list to flee the city, 10 leagues away from Paris. Among the guardians, one was but a man of straw, left to linger in the antechamber, while the other joined our evening gatherings, a quiet presence at our cards. The family of the prisoner has never ceased to hold the judge and his family in deep gratitude, for it was this man who saved a life that might otherwise have been lost. When the prisoner returned from Egypt, a man transformed by distant lands and war, he sought to repay the kindness, but the judge was gone, his place empty. Amidst this turmoil, letters, precious words and memories were stolen from me by the hands of the police, silenced before they could speak. Yet the world outside was shifting, eyes turning to a man who had risen from the common throng, whose deeds during an extraordinary crisis had set him apart. He was spoken of as the future general of the army of Italy, a man whose modest beginnings and limited ambitions were now overshadowed by the bright glare of destiny. Letters once lost were restored, revealing a past filled with humble wishes, connections to those deemed enemies of the new order, and the shadows of exile and death that loomed over them. The 13th of Vendémiaire approached, the 5th of October, 1795, a date etched into the annals of a nation struggling to find its way through the storm. The National Convention, weary and wary, had forged a new constitution, born from the agony of upheaval, known as the Constitution of Year 3. They sought to secure their power, insisting that 2/3 of their number remain in the new legislature, a move opposed by many who yearned for change and the end of tyranny. The sections of Paris, powerful and influential, rejected this decree, standing firm against the convention's grip. Tensions simmered, and the convention, feeling the threat, declared it would retreat to Chalon-sur-Marne if attacked, summoning the commanders of the armed forces to its defense. The day of reckoning came on the 5th of October, a day that would mark a turning point in the extraordinary destiny of Bonaparte. The events of that day would ripple across Europe, igniting political convulsions and feeding the flames of a young general's ambition. The years that followed were filled with such extraordinary events that they seemed to belong to another world, and the man who bore the name Bonaparte stood at their center, destined to believe himself immortal. Living quietly in Sens since July, I only learned of the insurrection from the whispers of the public and the printed words of the journals. I cannot say what role Bonaparte played in the intrigues that preceded the day, for he was officially described as a secondary actor. The account of the affair, published under his hand, bore the unmistakable marks of his style, its peculiar spelling and phrasing. He sent me a copy, a carefully crafted narrative that sought to place the blame for the first bloodshed on the rebels themselves, casting them as the aggressors. He often told me that he regretted the day bitterly, that he would give years of his life to erase it from history's page. He believed the people of Paris held a terrible grudge against him, and he wished that Barras had never delivered his speech in the convention, praising Bonaparte's skill and promptness in defending the assembly. Though true, such truths are not always easy to bear. Being far from Paris and a stranger to the tangled web of events, I cannot say how much of his success was due to fortune or his own efforts. He portrayed himself as a mere assistant to Barras in that grim and bloody scene. On that morning, at 5 o'clock, Barras was named Commander-in-Chief of the Army of the Interior, and Bonaparte was made second in command. The artillery destined for the frontier lay scattered, guarded by a handful of men, the depots unprotected, and the city's defences sparse. Barras ordered the artillery to be moved swiftly to the Tuileries, selecting men from various battalions and placing them at the palace. Forces were sent to guard key positions, cartridges gathered, and workshops established to supply the troops. General Verdier commanded at the Palais National with a calm that belied the chaos, instructed not to fire a shot until the last moment, even as reports came in of the sections arming and gathering in force. Cannons were positioned to fire down the streets, howitzers placed to batter the houses from which the convention might be attacked. As the rebel columns emerged from every street, the attack began, and the insurgents were routed. French blood was spilled that day, and with it, the stain of rebellion fell upon the sections. Among the dead were those once called nobles and emigrants. The prisoners were mostly the chouans of Charette. Yet the sections did not yield. They sought refuge in churches and theatres, calling the people to arms with furious cries. To prevent further bloodshed, the generals pursued them relentlessly through the night, firing cannon to thwart their attempts at fortification. At dawn, news came of students marching with cannons to aid the rebels, only to be intercepted by dragoons who seized their guns and brought them to the Tuileries. The weakened sections still held their ground, barricading streets and placing cannons in the heart of the city. The generals advanced with steady determination, their forces arrayed to cut off retreat and crush the rebellion. The sections' courage faltered, and they abandoned their posts, forgetting the honor they were meant to uphold. Yet pockets of resistance lingered, and the struggle pressed on into the crowded places where patriots rallied. The streets filled with the restless, the cries of defiance mingling with the steady drumbeats of soldiers marching to secure the fragile order of a city torn by its own people. And once more, the drums rolled across the valley, echoing the relentless march of history, as the day's tumult gave way to the uncertain calm of the night. And so, as night fell, the march continued. The city of Paris, still trembling from the echoes of revolution and unrest, bore witness to a delicate yet decisive moment in the life of one man whose destiny would soon intertwine irrevocably with the fate of France itself. The section of Brutus, a district still thick with tension and suspicion, had been a point of unease, a stubborn ember refusing to be fully extinguished. A wife of a representative had been seized there, a symbol of the fragile hold the new order had on its own people. The generals moved with purpose. General Duvigier advancing along the boulevard to the Rue Poissonnière, General Berruyer stationed firmly at the Place Victoire, and General Bonaparte himself taking command at the Pont au Change, a vital crossing over the Seine, where the lifeblood of the city pulsed beneath the stone arches. The section of Brutus found itself encircled, the troops pressing forward with deliberate resolve. The Place de Grève, a square alive with the restless spirit of revolution, became the stage where the old and new France clashed. From the Aile Saint-Louis, from the venerable Théâtre Français, from the shadowed halls of the palace, crowds surged forth, their fears melting into renewed courage. The knives, the poniards, once wielded by the émigrés, those exiles and enemies of the revolution, had vanished, swallowed by the tide of patriotism that now reclaimed the streets. The people, in their collective heart, admitted their error, the mistakes of rebellion and unrest, yielding to the steady hand of order. By the following day, the sections of Les Pelletiers and the Théâtre Français, once hotbeds of resistance, lay disarmed and subdued. This small, brutal civil war, played out in the narrow streets and public squares, elevated Bonaparte into prominence. Yet the victory he claimed was a double-edged sword. Those he had defeated bore him grudges that would not fade, while those he supported eyed him with a wary dread, sensing in him an ambition that would not be sated. In time, the very principles he once fought against would be resurrected, their echoes haunting the years to come. Upon his appointment, at the behest of Barras, as Lieutenant General of the Army of the Interior, Bonaparte established his headquarters in the Rue Neuve des Capucines. Contrary to the claims of the so-called Manuscrit de Sainte-Hélène, which suggested a period of inactivity after the coup of 13th Brumaire, Bonaparte was anything but idle. His days and nights were filled with the currents of power, the whispers of policy, and the intricate dance of personal ambition. His fingers traced the pulse of the nation. His ears caught every word uttered in the corridors of influence. He was a man ceaselessly engaged, almost daily conversing with those who held the reins of power, learning, adapting, and maneuvering with a relentless hunger. The Manuscrit de Sainte-Hélène itself, a work that stirred much attention upon its appearance, was a tangled web of half-truths and falsehoods, a masquerade of authenticity that no true observer of the times could accept. Its style was fractured, its contents a chaotic collage of distorted facts and imagined sentiments. It bore the hallmarks not of a man of action and clarity, but of a scribbler lost in affectation and error. The true Napoleon, with his sharp mind and direct speech, is nowhere to be found in those pages. Instead, the manuscript is cluttered with absurdities and trivial gossip, a shadow play that fails to capture the essence of the man who shaped an era. Rumours swirled about its authorship. Some whispered the name of Monsieur Bertrand, a former officer of the army of the Vistula and relative of the Comte de Simeon, while others speculated on more famous pens. Yet the truth remained elusive, a mystery wrapped in the fog of posthumous intrigue. Even Metternich, the great statesman, noted the manuscript's initial impact and the confusion it sowed across Europe, as it was mistaken for a prelude to the memoirs Napoleon might write in exile. But as time passed, the veil lifted, and the manuscript's true nature was laid bare, a curious, if clever forgery, lacking the soul of its supposed author. It was in this charged atmosphere that I returned to Paris from Sens, a city still alive with the restless energy of revolution and renewal. Bonaparte was no longer the distant figure I once knew. Our encounters, though less frequent, were charged with new purpose. We met often at breakfast or dinner, moments stolen from the relentless tide of public affairs. One day, he drew my attention to a young woman seated opposite him, a figure of quiet grace and gentle charm. He asked me what I thought of her, and my answer seemed to please him greatly. He spoke of her family, her virtues, and the promise he saw in their union. It was clear. This was no mere dalliance, but a bond he believed would bring him happiness and serve his ambitions. His influence with her was growing, weaving connections with the powerful and the influential, setting the stage for his ascent. Their marriage took place on the 9th of March, 1796, a union marked by harmony despite the occasional friction common to all who share a life. Bonaparte, to my knowledge, never caused his wife distress. Madame Bonaparte, Josephine, possessed a rare blend of personal charm and kindness. She was a woman whose presence captivated those around her, her beauty not conventional, but graced with a certain elegance and softness that drew the eye and heart alike. Her manner was gentle, her temper even, and her spirit kind, a refuge amid the storm of political upheaval. I recall the story of young Eugène, her son, who, no more than 14, approached Bonaparte to seek his father's sword, a symbol heavy with memory and meaning. The boy's frankness and earnestness touched Bonaparte, who granted the request without hesitation. The boy's tears, the kiss upon the blade, stirred a warmth in the general's heart. Madame de Beauharnais herself, upon learning of Bonaparte's kindness, felt compelled to express her gratitude, and their acquaintance quickly blossomed into a deeper bond. Yet, behind the gentleness and grace lay complexities. Madame Bonaparte's penchant for luxury and splendor was well known, a habit that often led to scenes of tension when the bills came due. She was generous to a fault, extending protection sometimes unwisely, and her credulity in the predictions of fortune-tellers added a layer of mystique to her character. She laughed at her own beliefs, yet never quite abandoned them, the prophecy of her rise to power casting a shadow over her fate. Before the momentous day of the 13th Vendémiaire, which would open the door to Bonaparte's vast career, he wrote to me from Paris. His words were tinged with a quiet hope, a vision of retreat and peace, a small piece of land in the valley of the Yonne, a place to call his own. Yet, even in this dream of tranquility, he drew a firm line. He would have nothing to do with national property, a statement revealing his complex relationship with the revolution's spoils. Bonaparte left Paris on the 21st of March, 1796, as I remained under the watchful care of my guardians. Soon after joining the French army, he received a letter from General Colli, commander of the Piedmontese forces, concerning the arrest of an officer named Moulin, a bearer of a flag of truce. The letter was a formal appeal, steeped in the customs and laws of war, pleading for the release of this officer despite his status as a French émigré. The letter spoke of courtesy and generosity, of hopes that the noble conduct between the two nations would continue unblemished. Bonaparte's reply was stark and unyielding. To him, an émigré was a parricide, a traitor to the very nation he once called home, and no rank or role could shield him from justice. The laws of war, he argued, had been broken by sending Moulin under a flag of truce, and threats of reprisal were dismissed with measured but firm disdain. His words carried the weight of a man who respected bravery and honor, but reserved no pity for those he deemed enemies of the people. The Directory, upon receiving these communications, approved the arrest, but ordered that Moulin be treated with care, neither brought to trial nor subjected to undue cruelty. These were the harsh realities of war, the fine line between justice and mercy, drawn anew with every conflict. As the year progressed, the Directory proposed a new command structure for the Army of Italy, suggesting General Kellerman as second in command alongside Bonaparte. But Bonaparte's reaction was one of quiet refusal, a letter to Carnot revealing his ambition and his unwillingness to serve under a man who saw himself as Europe's foremost general. He acknowledged Kellerman's experience, but feared that their joint command would lead only to discord and failure. Amid these grand maneuvers and shifting alliances, countless letters flowed between Bonaparte and his wife, Josephine. These missives, tender and strategic alike, offer a window into the man behind the soldier, the husband behind the general. They reveal a heart both restless and devoted, a mind calculating yet capable of warmth. And so, as the days lengthened and the campaigns loomed, their correspondence wove a tapestry of love, ambition, and the inexorable march of history. And so, as night fell, the march continued. Whether I shall be employed here or elsewhere matters little to me. My sole ambition is to serve my country and to earn from future generations a page in our history. Yet, if you join Kellerman and me in command in Italy, you will undo everything. General Kellerman has more experience than I and knows how to make war better than I do, but both together we shall make it badly. I will not willingly serve with a man who considers himself the first general in Europe. Among the many letters from Bonaparte to his wife that have been published, one stands apart. It is less adorned with extravagant declarations of love, less caught in the snares of affected style than most of the correspondence known to us. It is a letter announcing victory, a letter that breathes both relief and the restless hunger for glory. It was written at Verona on the 29th at noon. At last, my adored Josephine, I live again. Death no longer stands before me, and yet, within my breast, glory and honor still burn bright. The enemy has been beaten at Arcola. Tomorrow, we will repair the blunder of Vaubois, who abandoned Rivoli. In 8 days, Mantua will be ours, and then your husband will fold you in his arms and offer 1,000 proofs of his ardent affection. I shall proceed to Milan as soon as I can. I am a little fatigued. Letters from Eugène and Hortense have reached me, and I am delighted with the children. I will send you their letters as soon as my household, which is now somewhat dispersed, is reunited. We have taken 5,000 prisoners and killed at least 6,000 of the enemy. Adieu, my adorable Josephine. Think of me often. When you cease to love your Achilles, when your heart grows cold towards him, you will be very cruel, very unjust. But I am sure you will always remain my faithful mistress, as I shall ever be your fond lover. Death alone can break the union which sympathy, love, and sentiment have formed. Let me hear news of your health. 1,000 kisses, and 1,000 more. It is impossible for me to avoid sometimes placing myself in the foreground in these memoirs. I owe it to myself to answer, even if indirectly, certain charges made against me. Some of the documents I shall share belong less to the history of the General-in-Chief of the Army of Italy than to that of his secretary. Yet I must confess that I wish to show I was neither an intruder nor an obscure intriguer chasing fortune. Friendship, more than ambition, guided me to take part on the stage, where the rising glory of the future emperor already cast its light upon all who followed his destiny. The letters that follow, dictated by friendship and not intended for history, speak also of our military achievements, and whatever recalls the events of that heroic time still holds interest for many. At headquarters in Milan, on the 20th Prairial, Year 4, 8th June 1796, the General-in-Chief ordered me, my dear Bourrienne, to convey his pleasure upon hearing from you and his ardent wish that you should join us. Take your departure then, my dear friend, and come quickly. You may be certain of the affection due to you from all who know you, and we regret that you are not with us to share our success. This campaign we have just concluded will be celebrated in the records of history. With fewer than 30,000 men, in a state of almost complete destitution, it is remarkable that in less than 2 months we have beaten 8 times an army of from 65 to 70,000 men, compelled the King of Sardinia to make a humiliating peace, and driven the Austrians from Italy. The last victory, the passage of the Mincio, has closed our labours. Now remain the siege of Mantua and the castle of Milan, but these obstacles will not detain us long. Adieu, my dear Bourrienne. I repeat the General's request that you should come, and with it his desire to see you. Yet I was forced to remain at Sens, seeking to erase my name from the emigrant list, a request not granted until 1797, and to clear myself from a charge of fabricating a certificate of residence. Meanwhile, I devoted myself to study and preferred the peace of quiet to the turmoil of camps. For these reasons, I did not accept the friendly invitation, though eager to see my young college friend amid his astonishing triumphs. 10 months later, another letter came from Marmont, bearing the words, Headquarters, Gorizia, 2nd Germinal, Year 5, 22nd March, 1797. The General-in-Chief, my dear Bourrienne, has ordered me to express his wish for your prompt arrival here. We have long desired to see you and look forward with great pleasure to when we shall meet. I join with the General in urging you to join the army without delay. You will increase a united family, happy to receive you into its bosom. I enclose an order written by the General, which will serve as a passport. Take the post route and arrive as soon as you can. We are on the verge of penetrating into Germany. The language is already changing, and in 4 days no more Italian will be heard. Prince Charles has been well beaten, and we are pursuing him. If fortune favors us, we may sign a peace so necessary for Europe in Vienna. Adieu, my dear Bourrienne. Count on the zeal of one much attached to you. Signed, Marmont, Bonaparte, General-in-Chief of the Army of Italy, Headquarters, Gorizia, 2nd Germinal, Year 5. The citizen Bourrienne is to come to me on receipt of this order. Signed, Bonaparte. The odious manner in which I was harassed by the government over my certificate of residence made my stay in France unpleasant. I was even threatened with trial for producing a certificate allegedly signed by 9 false witnesses. This time, I resolved without hesitation to set out for the army. General Bonaparte's order, registered at the municipality of Sens, served as a passport, which otherwise would likely have been denied. I have always felt a strong gratitude for his conduct toward me on this occasion. Despite my haste to leave Sens, formalities delayed me for some days. As I was about to depart, I received another letter. Headquarters, Judenburg, 19th Germinal, Year 5, 8th April, 1797. The General-in-Chief again orders me, my dear Bourrienne, to urge you to come quickly. We are in the midst of success and triumphs. The German campaign begins even more brilliantly than the Italian. You may judge what promise it holds. Come, my dear Bourrienne, immediately. Yield to our solicitations, share our pains and pleasures, and you will add to our enjoyments. I have directed the courier to pass through Sens to deliver this letter and bring back your answer. Signed, Marmont. Alongside, this order was added. The citizen Fauvelet de Bourrienne is ordered to leave Sens and repair immediately by post to the headquarters of the Army of Italy. Signed, Bonaparte. I arrived in Venetian territory just as an insurrection against the French was about to break out. Thousands of peasants were stirred to rise under the pretext of quelling troubles in Bergamo and Brescia. I passed through Verona on the 16th of April, the eve of the preliminaries of Leoben and the revolt of Verona. Easter Sunday was chosen by the ministers of Jesus Christ to preach that it was lawful, even meritorious, to kill Jacobins. Death to Frenchmen, death to Jacobins, the cries that rang through the streets. At that time, I had no inkling of this turmoil, having left Sens only on the 11th of April. After a brief 2-hour stop in Verona, I continued my journey, unaware of the massacre looming over the city. About a league from Verona, I was halted by a party of insurgents, some 2,000 strong, as I estimated. They demanded I cry, "El viva Santo Marco," an order I quickly obeyed and passed on. What would have become of me had I been in Verona on that Monday? Bells rang out as Frenchmen were butchered in hospitals. Every person met in the streets was put to death. Priests led the assassins, and more than 400 Frenchmen were sacrificed. The forts withstood the furious Venetian attacks, but the town was reclaimed only after 10 days. On the very day Verona rose, Frenchmen were killed between Verona and Vicenza, through which I had passed safely the day before. Barely had I passed Padua when I learned others had been massacred there. The assassinations travelled as swiftly as the post. A few words must be said about the revolt of the Venetian states, which, due to differing political views, has been seen in very contradictory lights. The last days of Venice were near, and a storm had been brewing for more than a year. Around early April 1797, signs of a general insurrection appeared. The quarrel began when the Austrians occupied Peschiera, and tensions rose over the reception given to Monsieur, later Louis XVIII. Venice had made military preparations during the siege of Mantua in 1796. The interests of the aristocracy outweighed political considerations favorable to us. On the 7th of June 1796, General Bonaparte wrote to the Executive Directory, "The Senate of Venice recently sent 2 judges of their council here to ascertain the state of affairs. I repeated my complaints and spoke to them about the reception given to Monsieur. Should you plan to extract 5 or 6 million from Venice, I have prepared this kind of rupture for you. If your intentions are more decided, I think this ground of quarrel ought to be maintained. Let me know what you intend to do, and wait for the favorable moment, which I will seize as circumstances dictate, for we must not engage with all the world at once." The Directory answered that the moment was not favorable. First, Mantua must be taken, and Wormser given a sound beating. However, by the end of 1796, the Directory began to trust more in the neutrality professed by Venice. It was resolved to be content with obtaining money and supplies for the army, and to refrain from violating neutrality. The Directory had not yet conceived, as Bonaparte had, the idea of dismembering Venice to compensate for Austrian territories the Republic might retain. In 1797, the favoured moment arrived. The knell of Venice was rung. Bonaparte wrote to the Directory on April 30th, "I am convinced the only course now is to destroy this ferocious and sanguinary government." On May 3rd, from Palma Nuova, he declared, "I see nothing to be done but to obliterate the Venetian name from the face of the globe." By late March 1797, the Venetian government was in despair. Ottolini, the podesta of Bergamo and an instrument of tyranny in the hands of the state inquisitors, harassed the people of Bergamo and Brescia, who, after Mantua's fall, wished to separate from Venice. He drafted a report for the Senate on the plans of separation, based on information from Marcelline Serpini, a Roman advocate who claimed to have gleaned facts from conversations with French officers. The Patriotic Party's plan was to unite the Venetian mainland territories with Lombardy, forming one republic. Ottolini's conduct enraged those opposed to Venice and deepened discontent. Disguising his valet as a peasant, Ottolini sent him to Venice with the report and other intelligence, but the valet was arrested, the dispatches seized, and Ottolini fled Bergamo. This incident sparked the general uprising of the Venetian states. Indeed, the revolution's origin lay more in the spread of liberty's principles than in the crooked policy of Venice's Senate. Although Bonaparte claimed in his dispatches to the Directory that the Senate had instigated the insurrection, even he could not fully believe this. Pending the vacillation of the Venetian government, the tide of rebellion rose, and the fate of a once glorious republic hung in the balance. And so, as night fell, the march continued. The winds of change swept relentlessly through the lands once held by the proud and ancient Republic of Venice, stirring the hearts of its people and the ambitions of generals alike. The insurrection that erupted across those territories was not merely the work of cunning politicians or secret machinations, but arose from the deep currents of liberty and revolution that had begun to reshape the very soul of Europe. General La Hoz, commanding the Lombard Legion, stood as a vigorous guardian of this uprising, a living emblem of the growing desire for freedom that surged beyond the old insular government's reach. Though whispers in official dispatches spoke of the Venetian Senate as the instigator, even Bonaparte himself could not fully believe such claims. The truth was more complex, woven into the fabric of a people yearning to break free from the chains of their past. Meanwhile, across the plains and mountains, the city of Vienna worked to stir unrest against the French, fanning the flames of hatred and religious fervor among the populations of its mainland states. Venice's Senate, long hostile to the ideals of the French Revolution, had nurtured a seething animosity, condemning the upheaval with fervent zeal. From the late months of 1796, the Senate secretly prepared for war, their actions cloaked in perfidy, a desperate gambit to thwart even greater treacheries. They became the implacable foes of the French Republic, their efforts to arm the people against the revolutionary tide growing ever more desperate. In many villages, the common folk cried out in frustration, denied even the right to bear arms against the advancing French forces. Austrian generals, masters of deceit, spread dark rumors of the French army's weaknesses, painting them as vulnerable and scattered, hoping to ignite a mass uprising to crush the invaders as they sought to penetrate the hereditary states. The Archduke Charles's retreat into the heart of Austria emboldened Venice's Senate to believe that the French army, now thinly stretched across their mainland territories, could be easily destroyed. Wherever the Senate's influence held sway, secret plots and insurrections took root. Where patriots held the upper hand, passionate efforts strove to unite the Venetian mainland with the burgeoning Lombard Republic. Bonaparte, ever the shrewd tactician, seized upon these disturbances and the bloody chaos they wrought, adopting the voice of a scorned conqueror toward the Venetian Senate. His declaration was stark and unforgiving. The Venetian government was the very embodiment of treachery. Yet, it was the Senate's own weakness and duplicity that laid bare the path for his designs, a path that would see the Venetian Republic's proud sovereignty traded away without so much as a battle cry. Returning from Loban, triumphant and yet pacific, Bonaparte moved swiftly, taking possession of Venice without ceremony, altering its government, and claiming dominion over its territories. In the delicate negotiations at Campo Formio, he wielded Venice like a pawn, exchanging its lands to secure peace with Austria. On the 19th of May, he wrote to the Directory, revealing that one purpose of his treaty was to shield France from the stain of violating Venetian preliminaries, while simultaneously smoothing the way for their execution. Thus, at Campo Formio, the fate of the venerable Republic was sealed, not with the clash of swords or the roar of cannon, but in the quiet, cold halls of diplomacy. Venice melted away from the map of sovereign states, its power reduced to the fading echo of maritime glory and centuries of history. What resistance could it offer against a man destined to reshape all of Europe? On the 19th of April, I joined Bonaparte at Leoben, the day after the signature of those preliminary accords. They bore little resemblance to the definitive treaty that would later emerge at Campo Formio. At that moment, the fall of Venice was incomplete, its lands not yet ripe for division. The small states caught between two colossal empires at war found themselves at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. From that day, my relationship with Bonaparte shifted. No longer was he the comrade I had once known. He had grown suddenly great, powerful, and surrounded by a halo of homage and glory. Our conversations became more measured, our familiarity tempered by the vast social distance his victories had created. When I entered the salon, where he stood among his brilliant staff of officers, his voice rang out, "I am glad to see you at last." Yet when we were alone, he expressed appreciation for my reserve, a quiet gratitude for the respect I showed his new stature. That very evening, I spoke to him of the Venetian insurrection, the dangers threatening the French, and the perils I had narrowly escaped. His reply was resolute and cold. "Care thou nothing about it. Those rascals shall pay for it. Their republic has had its day and is done." Yet in truth, Venice still lived, wealthy, powerful, and proud. His words recalled to me the prophecy of Gabriel Naudet, who long ago had written of empires like Constantinople and Venice, once mighty, yet doomed to fall when their time came. In our first talks, I sensed Bonaparte's dissatisfaction with the preliminaries. He desired to press onward, to carry his army to Vienna itself. He did not hide this ambition from me. Before offering peace to Prince Charles, he had written to the Directory, counting on the support of the armies of the Sambre-Meuse and the Rhine. Yet the Directory dashed his hopes, forbidding any such cooperation, insisting that those armies would not cross the river. This unexpected decree forced him to end his triumphs and abandon his dream of planting the Republic's standard upon the ramparts of Vienna, or at least of levying contributions from its suburbs. A law of August 1794 forbade the use of any names other than those in the birth registry. I sought to abide by this, calling myself Fauvelet the Younger, as my eldest brother was still living. But this small change displeased General Bonaparte. "Such change of name is absolute nonsense," he said. "I have known you for 20 years by the name of Bourrienne. Sign as you still are named, and let the lawyers and their laws deal with it." On April 20th, as Bonaparte journeyed back to Italy, he was halted on an island in the Tagliamento by a roaring torrent swollen from a violent storm. A courier arrived on the far bank, crossing to the island with dispatches from the Directory. There, Bonaparte learned that the armies of the Sambre-Meuse and the Rhine were in motion, having crossed the Rhine and begun hostilities on the very day the preliminaries were signed. This news came a full 7 days after the Directory had told him not to expect such cooperation. The vexation that clouded his mind was palpable. He had agreed to the preliminaries only because the government claimed the German armies could not assist, yet now he found they had moved forward without him. For a moment, he contemplated crossing to the left bank and breaking off negotiations under some pretext, but Berthier and other generals persuaded him otherwise. What a difference there would have been in the preliminaries, if indeed there had been any, he exclaimed, the bitterness in his voice betraying his deep frustration. His chagrin deepened when, days after entering Venetian lands, he received a letter from General Moreau, dated April 23rd. Moreau reported that he had crossed the Rhine on the 20th with brilliant success, capturing 4,000 prisoners, and that he would soon join Bonaparte. What might have been, had the Directory not wavered and distrusted the young conqueror's ambitions? Had the Rhine crossing occurred earlier, Bonaparte might have dictated peace terms in Vienna itself, or, if Austria resisted, marched onward to seize the city. Yet, the jealousies and intrigues within the Directory sacrificed the glory of France and the honor of its arms. Even after receiving news of Moreau's triumph, Bonaparte lamented in a letter on May 8th that the crossing had not taken place 15 days sooner, or at least that Moreau had not declared himself ready. Such facts dissolve the unfounded accusations that Bonaparte, out of jealousy, deprived France of a longer campaign's benefits. His devotion to France's glory was too profound to allow such selfishness. As we journeyed through the Venetian states toward Milan, Bonaparte often spoke of Venice. He insisted that he had no hand in the insurrections that had shaken the country, reasoning that his plan to advance into the Danube basin left him no interest in having his rear threatened by revolt or his lines of communication severed. Such an idea, he said, would be absurd, and could never enter the mind of a man to whom even his enemies cannot deny a certain degree of tact. He admitted he was not displeased with how events had unfolded, having already leveraged these circumstances in the preliminaries, and hoping to gain still more in the final peace. "When I arrive at Milan," he promised, "I will occupy myself with Venice." It became clear to me that Bonaparte had no initial role in the Venetian uprisings, yet he was not unhappy with their outcome, and in time he profited greatly from them. On May 5th, we arrived at Milan, having passed through Laubach, Thrust, Palma Nova, Padua, Verona, and Mantua. Bonaparte soon took up residence at Montebello, a grand chateau 3 leagues from Milan, overlooking the vast and fertile plains of Lombardy. There, the negotiations for the definitive peace began, culminating later at Passeriano. The Austrian plenipotentiary, the Marquis de Gallo, resided just half a league from Montebello, a constant reminder of the delicate dance of diplomacy unfolding. During his stay at Montebello, Bonaparte ventured on excursions to the Lake of Como and the Ago Maggiore, visiting the Borromean Islands one after another. Upon returning, he turned his attention to organizing the cities of Venice, Genoa, and Milan. Yet, in his search for capable men to aid his cause, he found few worthy. "Good God," he exclaimed, "how rare men are! There are 18 million in Italy, and I have with difficulty found two, Dandolo and Melzi." He understood their value well. Dandolo was a man who shone with honor in those revolutionary times, having served on the great council of the Cisalpine Republic and as Proveditore General in Dalmatia. The grateful inhabitants of Dalmatia still remember his just and vigorous governance. Melzi, too, was known, Chancellor and Keeper of the Seals of the Italian monarchy, later created Duke of Lodi. Such scarcity of talent did not surprise those familiar with the world's workings. As Madame Roland, a woman of sharp intellect, once remarked upon her husband's rise and her encounters with those in power, she found the universal mediocrity which exists surpasses all that the imagination can conceive, from the clerk to the minister. And who could forget Oxenstiern's words to his son, trembling to attend the Congress of Münster? "Go, my son. You will see by what sort of men the world is governed." As the preliminaries of Leoben held a fragile truce, Napoleon was not eager to respond immediately to the flood of letters that arrived. He fancied a manner not unlike Cardinal Dubois, who once burned his correspondence, dismissing them with a wave as if to say, "There, my correspondence." But the story of those days, the release of prisoners at Olmütz, the tense negotiations with Austria, and the restless dissatisfaction of Bonaparte himself, would soon unfold in a tapestry of letters and intercepted dispatches, of complaints sent to the executive directory, and secret notes circulated among the army, each a thread weaving the complex fabric of this turning moment in history. And so, as night fell, the march continued. During the quiet pause that followed the signing of the preliminaries at Leoben, the great General Bonaparte found himself not immediately compelled to respond to the endless flood of correspondence that came to him from all corners of the Republic. It was a curious habit he took up, a kind of deliberate neglect that was neither careless nor dismissive, but rather a test of patience and purpose. He instructed that only the letters arriving by special couriers should be opened at once, while all others were to be placed aside, untouched, in a basket for 3 full weeks. When the time came to revisit these messages, he found that most had already answered themselves in some way. Some were mere acknowledgments, others repeated requests for favors already granted, or complaints about pay, provision, and clothing that had long since been addressed. Many letters sought reinforcements, promotions, or money, but by not opening them, Bonaparte spared himself the unpleasant task of refusal. He would laugh quietly at the wisdom of this method, pondering whether such a practice might not be preferable to the endless, often pointless, replies that filled the desks of men burdened by war. Meanwhile, in the tangled dance of diplomacy that followed the Treaty of Leoben, the Directory commanded Bonaparte to demand the release of certain French prisoners held in Olmütz, men of note, such as Lafayette, Latour Marbourg, and Bureau de Pouzy, who had languished in captivity since 1792. Bonaparte took this charge to heart, pursuing it with a zeal born of both duty and a sense of justice, yet he encountered obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Contrary to some mistaken accounts, their freedom was not granted as a clause in the treaty, nor was it a gift from the Austrians without struggle. It was only after months of persistent negotiation, after the delicate political upheaval of the 18th Fructidor had shaken the Republic, that these men were finally freed at the end of August. Such was the weight of the times that even the liberation of prisoners became a slow, arduous journey, requiring all of Bonaparte's strength and influence to bring to fruition. As July wore on, the negotiations dragged with a weariness that tested the patience of all involved. The constant delays and obstructions could be attributed only to the cunning of Austria, whose artful diplomacy sought every advantage. Yet Bonaparte's mind was not solely occupied with foreign affairs. News from Paris stirred a restless fire within him. He read with growing displeasure the harsh criticisms from powerful orators and the biting pamphlets that questioned his victories, his army, the fate of Venice, and the very glory of France. The suspicions cast upon him, the whispered doubts about his intentions, ignited a fierce indignation deep within his heart. He, who had led armies across mountains and rivers, who had brought the Republic triumph after triumph, found himself beset by mistrust and slander. Voices like those of Dumouriez and Rivarol echoed through the pages of the time, their words both a tribute and a torment. They praised Bonaparte's brilliance, calling him the most dazzling warrior to lead the Republic's armies. Yet they warned that such glory was at odds with the ideals of democracy, that it bred hatred and ingratitude. They saw in him a man of fiery spirit, swift and unrelenting, a force like an unchained torrent, striking with heavier blows as he advanced, never hesitating to cut through the Gordian knots of war and politics alike. Yet these same voices cast shadows, suggesting that his meteoric rise would be shadowed by accusations and persecution, a long and bitter road ahead. Unable to bear the weight of such calumny, and enraged by the intrigues taking shape against him within the Club of Clichy, Bonaparte penned a letter to the Executive Directory, a letter sharp with the pain of betrayal and the sting of injustice. He spoke of his 5 acts of peace, his blows against the coalition, and the hope that he might live quietly beneath the protection of the Republic's leaders. Instead, he found himself attacked by shameful means, persecuted by those who should have been his allies. He lamented the absurd and atrocious accusations, the disbelief in the massacre of his men, the sight of hundreds of French soldiers dragged through the streets and cut down before the eyes of their governor. He demanded respect, a recognition of the sacrifices made, and once more asked for dismissal, longing for peace away from the poisoned daggers of factional strife. At the same time, he composed a note concerning Venice, a place caught in the throes of upheaval, yet under his protection. He reminded the army and the people that he had not sought to destroy the ancient government of Venice, nor to impose democracy upon Genoa or the Swiss cantons. Rather, he had shown kindness and respect, sparing Venice from ruin and pillage, even as insurrections broke out. The massacre of more than 400 French troops in Venetian territories was a cruel blow, a betrayal of trust. Yet when he returned to Italy, calm once again settled like a gentle tide. His troops maintained order, prevented further bloodshed, and supported the provisional government, acting as guardians, rather than conquerors. He could not turn away from Venice, for the laws of war gave him the authority to police the lands where battles had been fought. As the great Frederick had said, there were no neutrals in war. Bonaparte's note cast a clear light on the accusations from the Club of Clichy, exposing their true intent: to undermine the army's triumphs, to question the conquest of Italy, the crossing of the Alps, the march toward Vienna, and the very peace that had been won. But Bonaparte, speaking for 80,000 soldiers, warned that the days when such base declamations could stir revolt were gone, and if forced, the army would stand united, general and men alike, at the gates of Clichy. Yet woe to those who dared provoke that storm. As Bonaparte advanced to Palma Nova and then to Mestre, the government of Venice sent deputies with decrees seeking his protection and intervention. The ancient government, long in decline and burdened by illness and age, needed renewal to preserve its honor and independence. Bonaparte demanded justice for the massacre of his brethren in arms, insisting the inquisitors be arrested, yet he offered an armistice and called for negotiation in Milan, striving to restore peace and order amidst the chaos. But Venice was still gripped by anarchy, threatened by pillage and unrest, and the city teetered precariously on the edge of ruin. He issued a manifesto to the Doge, listing grievances and warning of consequences, which led to the French minister's expulsion and the tearing down of Venice's proud symbols across the continent. Meanwhile, Bonaparte's thoughts turned ever more clearly toward Paris. His intention to march upon the capital was no secret among the army, and the news reached Vienna, stirring unease among the imperial court. It was at this moment that a letter from Emperor Francis II to his brother, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, fell into Bonaparte's hands, intercepted in the shadows of war and politics. As he translated the words, he saw the emperor's knowledge of his designs, the wavering resolve of the Austrian throne, the delicate balance of power resting on the fate of the Italian princes. So much depended on the will of a single man, so much on the relentless ambition of Bonaparte himself. And so, as night fell, the march continued. In those days, the whispers and rumors that drifted through the camps and courts alike seemed to swirl endlessly, carried on the restless winds of uncertainty and suspicion. It was well known within the army, and soon the news reached the ears of those in Vienna that the Emperor Francis II himself had sent a letter to his brother, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, a letter that was intercepted by Bonaparte's forces and carefully translated. Within those lines lay a glimpse into the mind of the emperor, revealing not only his awareness of Bonaparte's designs, but also the delicate, wavering resolutions that gripped his heart and court. The letter spoke of a profound unease, a hesitation born of the shifting fortunes of Italian princes and the looming shadow of republicanism that Bonaparte threatened to cast across the land. Francis II expressed his love of peace, yet his words trembled with uncertainty, caught between the desire to preserve the old order and the fear of what might come to pass. "My dear brother," the letter began, a tone of both affection and sorrow weaving through the script, "I punctually received your third letter, containing a description of your unhappy and delicate situation. You may be assured that I perceive it as clearly as you do yourself, and I pity you the more because, in truth, I do not know what advice to give you." The emperor's words lingered in the air, a soft echo of helplessness, as he lamented the inactivity of Italy's princes, who had failed to act united when Mantua was still his to hold. He spoke of Bonaparte's project, the establishment of republics, and the spreading flame of republicanism that threatened to consume the ancient order. Negotiations for peace had begun, preliminaries ratified, yet the French, he feared, were already beginning to disregard their promises. The crux of the matter, he confided, lay with the French Directory and their approval or disapproval of Bonaparte's bold and uncertain moves. There was talk, whispered like a shadow in the night, that Bonaparte might rebel against his own country, a suspicion born from his harsh treatment of Switzerland, despite assurances to the contrary. And so, with a heart heavy and uncertain, the emperor could offer no counsel but to wait and watch, for only time and circumstance could reveal the path ahead. This letter, dated July 20th, 1797, from Hetzendorf, was but one thread in the tapestry of those tumultuous times. As the story of that year unfolded, so too did the myriad rumors and misconceptions that clung to Bonaparte like a cloak. Among the most persistent was the belief, whispered in drawing rooms and taverns alike, that Carnot, the great strategist, dictated every movement from a hidden chamber in the Luxembourg, that Berthier stood ever at Bonaparte's right hand, guiding and correcting, without whom the young general would be lost. Yet such notions were far from the truth. Bonaparte was no mere follower of plans drawn up far from the smoke and mud of battlefields. He was a creator, a master of war whose genius was forged in the crucible of action. The instructions from the Directory, sent with the distant certainty of those who had never felt the cold bite of winter marches or heard the thunder of cannon fire close at hand, were little more than suggestions to be weighed and often cast aside. I recall, as I served as secretary to the General-in-Chief, reading a dispatch from the Directory in May of 1796, entrusting Bonaparte with the entire conduct of the campaign. From that moment, every movement, every decision was his alone. Carnot himself, great as he was, had no choice but to yield to Bonaparte's unyielding will. Towards the close of that year, as the prospect of peace began to glimmer faintly on the horizon, General Clark was sent to negotiate an armistice. Should Mantua remain unconquered, the proposal was to leave the blockade as it was, allowing the Emperor of Austria to supply the city's garrison and inhabitants daily. But Bonaparte, ever vigilant and resolute, opposed this with all his might, convinced that peace without Mantua was no peace at all. He carried his point, and Mantua fell, its capitulation a testament to the relentless hunger for glory that drove him and his army forward. Yet even in moments of triumph, Bonaparte was not blind to the precariousness of fate. During the blockade, as plans for an assault took shape, he confided in a letter to the Directory, "A bold stroke of this nature depends absolutely for success on a dog or a goose. The fragile thread of surprise, the uncertain element that could turn the tide, rested on chance as much as on courage." Bonaparte was deeply sensitive to the rumors that swirled around him, especially those concerning Carnot and Berthier. One day, he turned to me with a wry smile and said, "What gross stupidity is this? It is very well to say to a general, 'Depart for Italy, gain battles, and sign a peace at Vienna,' but the execution, That is not so easy. I never attached any value to the plans which the Directory sent me. Too many circumstances occur on the spot to modify them. The movement of a single corps of the enemy's army may confound a whole plan arranged by the fireside. Only fools can believe such stuff. As for Berthier, since you have been with me, you see what he is. He is a blockhead. Yet it is he who does it all. It is he who gathers a great part of the glory of the army of Italy. I told him that such an erroneous opinion could not endure, that each man would be granted his due, and that at least history would judge rightly. This seemed to please him, and he allowed the thought to settle quietly in his mind. Berthier was a man of honor and courage, steady and precise in his duties. Bonaparte's attachment to him was born more of habit than affection. Berthier's bluntness and abrupt manner did not endear him to many, yet he made few enemies. He spoke to me familiarly, though his letters retained a formal distance. He knew the disposition of every corps, the names of their commanders, the strength of their forces. Day or night, he was ever at hand, drafting with clarity the secondary orders that sprang from the General-in-Chief's grand designs. In truth, he was an excellent chief of staff, mastering the machinery of war with steady hands, but no more. His talents were limited, his character weak, and his devotion to Bonaparte unshakable. The frequent mention of his name in bulletins and reports had inflated his reputation beyond its true measure. Bonaparte himself, once praising Berthier's qualities to the Directory, later, in the solitude of exile, would call him a goose, neither praise nor insult fitting for a man of such simple but steadfast nature. Bonaparte was a man of habit, deeply attached to those around him, wary of strangers. Berthier loved him, carried out his orders well, and that alone was enough to secure his place. It was about this time that young Eugène de Beauharnais arrived in Milan, a boy of 17 who had lived in Paris with his mother since Bonaparte's departure. He entered the service as aide-de-camp to the General-in-Chief, who took to him with a quiet affection, recognizing in the youth qualities that deserved such regard. Meanwhile, in Venice, Comte Delaunay d'Entraigues, a figure well known in the shadows of the Revolution, held a diplomatic post as the city braced itself against the French advance. Suspected of being the agent behind many conspiracies against France, and particularly against the army of Italy, he sought to flee as the city was surrounded. But escape was denied, and he was seized, along with all his papers. His frank manners pleased Bonaparte, who treated him with a measure of indulgence. Most of his papers were returned, save 3 that touched on political secrets. Eventually, the Count fled to Switzerland, only to cast himself as a victim of oppression at the hands of Bonaparte, a falsehood that has misled many to see him as a heroic martyr. In truth, his story ended tragically when, in 1802, he was assassinated by his own servant. Among the papers seized, I kept a copy of one of his most intriguing documents, a manuscript that has stirred much debate, with some, like Fauche-Borel, denying its authenticity and truth. Yet the manner in which it came into Bonaparte's hands, the importance the Count himself attached to it, and the discrepancies I have noted between my copy and other versions, all bear witness to its genuine origin. The knowledge I hold, having transcribed it myself, lends weight to its authenticity. And so, As the days and nights of that summer of 1797 passed, the great drama of Italy's fate unfolded. Whispered secrets, shifting alliances, and the relentless march of an army, led by a man whose hunger for glory was as insatiable as the war was merciless. And so, as night fell, the march continued.